Summer 1975. Memphis. Methodist Hospital. Elvis Presley walked the corridor slowly, his chest tight, every step carrying the weight of years spent burning himself out on stage. To the world, he was still the king, untouchable, dazzling, immortal. But under the fluorescent lights, stripped of costumes and applause, he was just a man whose body was beginning to betray him. Then it happened. A young nurse stepped out from the shadows of the hallway. She recognized him instantly, not the legend millions adored, but the exhausted face, the weary eyes, the quiet drag of his steps. She didn't smile, didn't ask for an autograph, didn't whisper in awe. Instead, she looked straight at him and spoke words no one in his circle had ever dared to say. "You're killing yourself, Mr. Presley. And nobody around you has the courage to tell you." The corridor fell silent. Elvis froze, stunned. He had heard every kind of praise, every plea, every adoration. But this raw truth, cut deeper than any headline, any doctor's warning, any whispered rumor. For the first time in years, someone wasn't addressing the king. She was speaking to the man. And in that fragile, dangerous moment, Elvis realized he had no idea how to answer. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The corridor stretched endlessly, a tunnel of pale walls broken only by harsh fluorescent light that hummed faintly overhead. The hour was late enough that the hospital felt abandoned. No chatter of nurses at their stations, no shuffle of carts, no echo of voices. Just the sharp scent of antiseptic lingering in the air, heavy and inescapable. Each step Elvis took landed with a muted thud against the polished floor. Deliberate, almost reluctant, as though his body carried more than its own weight. He walked slowly, his shoulders slightly bent. The posture of a man whose spine had been trained to stay upright under the gaze of millions, but was now giving in to the fatigue that no applause could cure. For the first time in weeks, he had asked to move through the hospital without his entourage. No bodyguards circling like shadows, no assistants whispering updates, no doctor hovering beside him. He wanted silence. He wanted, just for a breath, to stop being Elvis Presley, the king, and to simply walk like a patient down a sterile hallway. The irony was bitter. He had lived years surrounded by deafening cheers, and now he discovered that silence pressed on his chest with just as much force. He slowed at the corner, where a wide window looked out into the dark. Memphis at night was out there, neon blinking, rain washing over the pavement in streaks that caught the glow of the street lamps. Yet inside, under the white hospital lights, he felt stripped of the armor he wore on stage. The sequined jumpsuits, the roar of the band, the sweat of performance, none of it mattered here. Here, among the sterile walls and the faint buzzing of electricity, he was reduced to a man who could not outsing his own body's decline. That was when she appeared. From the opposite end of the hallway, a nurse stepped into view. Her uniform was crisp, her shoes squeaked softly against the floor, but her expression was steady, almost too steady. She must have known who he was. Everyone in the building did, but she approached him without the shy smile or flustered awe he was used to. No trembling request for an autograph, no whispered, "Oh my God, it's him." She simply looked at him as if he were another patient, another man walking the halls with too much on his mind. When she stopped him, her words were not what he expected. "Mr. Presley," she said firmly, her tone neither deferential nor rehearsed. Not Elvis, not the king, not Sir, just Mr. Presley. The name landed like a pebble dropped into still water, rippling through the air. He blinked, pausing mid-step, caught off guard by the way she framed him. Not as an idol, not as a myth, but as someone ordinary. That alone unsettled him. But what followed reached deeper. "You're killing yourself," she said flatly, her eyes locked on his. "And nobody around you seems willing to tell you the truth." For a heartbeat, the corridor seemed to contract, every fluorescent hum falling silent in his ears. He stared at her, stunned by the bluntness. He was used to people feeding him comfort, soft words, endless flattery. Agents, fans, friends, each one orbiting him with rehearsed lines and careful tones, never daring to break through the golden cage of his legend. This nurse, in a plain uniform under hospital lights, had just done what no one else had dared. She told him the truth, with no cushion, no apology. Something in him stiffened. A flicker of offense rose in his chest. Who was she to speak to him like that? A stranger, someone who didn't know the endless demands, the hunger of the crowd, the pressure of carrying a crown he had never asked for. His instinct was to pull back, to retreat into the armor of his status. Yet alongside the sting of her words came an unfamiliar tug, curiosity. He felt it like a draft sneaking through a closed door. Why would she risk speaking that way? Why did her voice sound more real than anything he had heard in months? He searched her face for signs of malice, or pity, or the familiar gleam of someone eager to make a story out of him. There was none. Just steadiness, the quiet strength of someone who had looked death in the eyes too many times in her work to waste time on flattery. Elvis shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how heavy his body felt, how each breath seemed slightly more labored than it should have been for a man his age. The words she had spoken landed like a mirror held up without warning. For a moment, he wanted to laugh it off, to reply with the charm he used on reporters and strangers alike. But the echo of her statement hung there, unshaken. "You're killing yourself." He felt the hallway close in, the antiseptic sting in his nose suddenly sharper. The reality of it all pressed against him. This was no stage, no performance. Here he stood, not as the king, but as a man stripped of applause, confronted in the loneliest corner of a hospital by someone who refused to play along with the myth. The silence stretched between them, charged and fragile. Elvis drew a slow breath, the weight of her words sinking deeper with every second. For the first time that night, he wasn't sure if he wanted to keep walking or if he needed to stop and face what had just been placed before him. And so he stopped. Elvis did not move. His body remained still, suspended in the white glow of the corridor as if rooted to the floor. The nurse's blunt words still pulsed in his mind, but it was her steady gaze that held him there. She seemed unafraid of his silence, unshaken by the weight of who he was. Then, without warning, she shifted the conversation into territory he had not crossed in years. "You know," she said quietly, "my mother used to work here. She remembered the day your mama was brought in." 1958. Her words struck him harder than the accusation she had just delivered. The sound of that year alone made something inside him jolt. His mouth went dry, his chest tightened. He hadn't heard a stranger speak of that time in decades. People avoided it around him, as though they knew the wound was too raw, too sacred to be touched. The nurse went on, her tone even, her eyes softer now. "She told me about a young man in the hallway, dressed in uniform, pacing back and forth like the floor was burning beneath him. She said he was trembling, praying and crying all at once. That was you, wasn't it?" The sterile corridor blurred around him, replaced by a memory he had buried deep. The sharp tang of hospital disinfectant, mingling with the faint smell of his mama's perfume. He remembered the heavy steps of soldiers' boots, echoing in his ears even after he'd shed the uniform. He remembered sitting outside her room, his fists pressed against his eyes to block out the sight of her slipping away. His voice, when it came, was hoarse, barely audible. "Yes," the nurse nodded, almost as though she had expected the confession. "She told me you swore that night you'd never end up like her, that you would take care of yourself, live stronger. She said you were just a boy making a promise to a ghost." She paused, then tilted her head, her words sharp but tinged with sadness. "But look at you now. Tell me you've kept that promise." The blow was surgical, precise, impossible to deflect. Elvis felt a surge of heat in his chest, as though shame and anger were fighting for space inside him. His jaw tightened. No one, not his friends, not his family, not the doctors paid to keep him going, had ever spoken so directly. And yet, her words pulled back the veil, forcing him to see himself as that boy again, broken in a hospital hallway, vowing never to repeat the cycle. He drew in a shallow breath, and his mind pulled him back fully into that night. He was 23, already a star, yet still just Gladys's only son. She had always been the anchor in his storm, the one who kept him from floating away when the lights and the noise threatened to consume him. He could still hear her voice, soft and steady, singing the lullabies that once filled their tiny home in Tupelo. Songs that had no audience, no applause, just a mother's voice to soothe her boy. He remembered how she would touch his hair, whisper prayers over him when they had nothing but faith to live on. The memory shifted, darker. He saw the coffin, the cameras flashing as if his grief were a spectacle for the world. He had tried to hold himself together, to be the strong man he promised her he would become. But behind the dark glasses, his eyes had stung with tears he could not stop. The press hounded him even there, turning his heartbreak into headlines. He had wanted to scream, to push them all away, to hide in the earth with her. Instead, he had stood there, shoulders stiff, wearing the mask of control the world expected. Now, in this hospital corridor years later, the mask cracked. He clenched his fists, his throat tightening with the weight of it all. He had avoided thinking of that night, avoided speaking of it, because the guilt that followed was unbearable. Guilt that he had promised strength, but had chosen pills and endless schedules instead. Guilt that his mother had begged him to live a good life, and he had drowned himself in a world of excess. The nurse's voice pulled him back to the present. She believed in you. She believed you would outlive the pain. He turned his head toward her, his eyes glistening, not with stage tears or showmanship, but with something unpracticed, raw. For a moment, he hated her for prying, for ripping open a scar he had worked so hard to bury. And yet, deep inside, part of him was grateful. Because she had remembered his mama. Because she had spoken her name without ceremony, without hesitation. "Do you know," he whispered, his voice barely steady, "she used to tell me I was her sunshine? Said she could hear me singing before I ever walked through the door." His lips trembled, the corner of his mouth fighting between a smile and a collapse. "And I promised her I'd make her proud. That I'd stay strong. But all I've done is—" His voice broke, and he stopped, unable to finish the thought. The nurse didn't move, didn't reach out. She simply let the silence sit between them, unflinching. It was a silence that carried more weight than any applause. The corridor seemed narrower now, the sterile lights brighter, almost cruel. Elvis felt the press of memories all around him. The boy he had been, the mother he had lost, the vow he had broken. The nurse had done what no one else dared. She had reminded him of the moment that defined him, and how far he had strayed from the boy who had once sworn never to repeat his mother's fate. For the first time in years, the king of rock and roll felt like that trembling boy in uniform again, lost in a hospital, praying for a miracle that never came. And this time, he wondered if there was still time to find his way back. The silence between them lingered like a held breath, pressing against Elvis's chest. The corridor, with its humming lights and antiseptic air, had become a stage of its own. A place where no audience cheered, no orchestra swelled, no spotlight saved him. Only the truth remained, stark and bare. The nurse finally spoke, her voice calm, almost too calm. "Tell me, Mr. Presley, with all the lights, the money, the crowds, are you happy?" The question pierced deeper than her earlier accusations. Happiness. He had been asked about success, about fame, about records and tours. But happiness? Rarely, if ever. The word itself felt foreign, like a language he hadn't spoken in years. His lips parted, then closed again, as if the truth threatened to escape, but he didn't know how to shape it into words. He looked away from her and turned to the wide window at the end of the hall. Beyond the glass was nothing but darkness. The Memphis night, thick with rain. Neon bled faintly through the wet streaks on the pane, but no sound reached inside. The reflection staring back at him was not the king, not the glittering performer the world worshipped. It was a man with tired eyes, his face heavier than his age, shoulders drawn down as though the very air crushed him. "I'm tired," he said finally, his voice low, almost confessional. "So tired." The words surprised even him. He had carried exhaustion for years, masked beneath rehearsed charm and the adrenaline of performance. Yet here, in this fluorescent silence, he allowed the truth to breathe. "They all want the king," he continued, his tone weighted with resignation. "On stage, in interviews, even when I'm eating dinner, they're waiting for the king. But I just want to be a son again, a father, a husband, a man who can walk into a room without everyone watching every breath he takes." The nurse studied him, her eyes unwavering. She didn't nod politely or offer comforting platitudes. Instead, she spoke with a steady honesty that cut through the space between them. "I've seen you perform, Mr. Presley. Do you know what struck me most? It wasn't the music or the suits. It was how your chest pounded. I could see it from the balcony, your heart beating like it was trying to break free. I thought to myself, how much more can one body endure?" Her words sank like stones into water, rippling through memories of the nights when he staggered off stage drenched, gasping, his body trembling under the weight of his own voice. He had seen the worry in the eyes of his bandmates, the quiet glances of the doctors backstage. He had ignored them all, convincing himself that pushing harder was the only way to prove he was still alive. "You think you're saving people with your songs," she said, softer now but no less piercing. "Maybe you are. But tell me, who is saving you?" The question carved through the air. Elvis felt his throat tighten, his hands curl into fists at his sides. The instinct was to deflect, to turn her question into a joke, to disarm her with the charm that had melted so many before her. But this time, he didn't. He couldn't. His eyes drifted back to the window. The darkness outside seemed endless, swallowing the city whole. For once, he didn't imagine the lights of an audience waiting just beyond the glass. He saw nothing but emptiness. The silence of it was terrifying. Inside, he felt the weight of the crown he had worn for so long. To the world, he was a monument, a living myth. But inside, he was crumbling under the pressure of carrying that myth alone. He thought of the endless nights when the crowd's roar became deafening, only to be replaced by crushing silence once the curtain fell. Those were the moments when he felt least real, as if he vanished the moment the music stopped. He spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "I stand in front of thousands. They scream, they reach for me, they cry when I touch their hands. And yet—" His eyes flicked toward her, pained and unguarded. "When the music ends, I don't know who I am anymore." The confession startled him, the honesty of it. He felt stripped, laid bare in a way he hadn't been since he was a boy. It terrified him, and yet at the same time, it was a relief, like unclenching a fist that had been tight for years. The nurse did not move closer, nor did she look away. She let the silence wrap around his words, honoring them instead of filling the space with easy comfort. That silence felt heavier than any applause he had ever earned. Elvis pressed a hand to the cool glass of the window, as though seeking something solid in the reflection. The world outside blurred into streaks of rain and neon. Inside, his own image looked fragile, almost ghost-like. For a fleeting moment, he thought of his mother again, her voice calling him back to who he once was. The ache of that memory twisted inside him like a blade. He wanted to tell the nurse more, to admit the pills, the fear of sleep, the nights he woke gasping, convinced his heart would stop before morning. But the words caught in his throat. The truth felt too large to release all at once. Instead, he whispered, almost to himself, "Sometimes I feel like a prisoner of my own songs." The nurse's gaze softened. "Then maybe it's time to sing one for yourself." The words lingered in the air, quiet but powerful, pulling him into a silence deeper than any curtain drop. And for the first time, Elvis Presley wondered if he had the strength to listen. The corridor was no place for the words that had just passed between them. Too exposed, too hollow, too cold. The nurse gestured toward a small door tucked away near the stairwell, one of those staff rooms rarely noticed by anyone who didn't work there. She pushed it open without waiting for his answer, the gesture almost casual, as if inviting him into a kitchen rather than a sanctuary from the weight of his crown. Elvis hesitated only a second before following. The room was narrow, lined with lockers and a single round table scarred by years of coffee mugs and scribbled notes. A faint hum from an old vending machine filled the silence. The air smelled of cheap roast brewed hours earlier, mixed with the omnipresent bite of disinfectant. A dented percolator sat in the corner, still warm. She poured into 2 paper cups, handed one to him, and for the first time in what felt like years, he was treated like just another man on a sleepless night. Elvis sat down slowly, the chair creaking beneath his weight. The hot liquid seared his tongue at the first sip, bitter and watery, yet it grounded him. No crystal glasses, no silver trays, no polished performances of hospitality. Just hospital coffee in a paper cup, served without ceremony. It was almost a relief. She leaned back, studying him, her tone shifting from sternness to something closer to kinship. "My brother came back from Vietnam," she said quietly. "Barely made it. He wasn't the same man who left. Nightmares, shakes, the kind of silence that eats you alive. He told me once there were nights he only survived because of a radio, because of a voice singing about love, about home. Yours?" Elvis's hand stilled around the cup. His eyes flicked up, searching hers for exaggeration, for the soft edges of flattery he had heard too many times. But she wasn't embellishing. Her tone was steady, her eyes sharp, not begging him to feel like a savior, only reminding him of what had already been. "He said," she continued, her voice dipping with memory, "that man saved my soul when the jungle was trying to take it." She let the words hang between them like smoke. "And yet, here you sit, acting like your own soul isn't worth saving." For a moment Elvis let out a laugh, low, rough, unexpected. It wasn't the polished laugh that charmed interviewers or reassured nervous fans. It was jagged, unguarded, spilling out like air released from a balloon stretched too tight. He shook his head, staring into the swirl of the coffee as though it held answers. "You know," he said, his voice quiet but trembling at the edges, "I tell jokes on stage. I smile in interviews, but when I close my eyes—" He hesitated, then continued with the same bluntness she had shown him. "I dream of dying. Over and over. Always the same. My chest locks up, I can't breathe. And then, blackness. Sometimes I see my mama. Sometimes I don't. But every time I wake up, I wonder if one night I won't." The nurse didn't flinch. She didn't gasp, didn't reach for a polite word to soften the blow of his admission. She simply let it sit, raw and unpolished. And in her stillness, he felt a strange comfort, as though by not rushing to console him, she was giving him permission to finally speak. His fingers tapped against the paper cup. "I never told that to anyone. Not the boys, not the doctors, not even family. You start talking about fear, and they tell you to be strong. They remind you who you are, what you mean to people. But they don't see me when I'm alone. They don't see me when the lights go out, and I can't tell if my heart will still be beating in the morning." The words tasted like iron on his tongue. For once, he wasn't reciting a story, wasn't shaping himself into a legend. He was simply admitting the terror that stalked him in silence. The nurse nodded slowly, her eyes softer now. "You let the world call you a king. But kings are still men, and men bleed, men break, even men like you." He let out a slow breath, leaning back in the chair. The fluorescent light above flickered once, then steadied, its glow bouncing off the pale walls. The contrast struck him, the cold sterility of the hospital against the warmth of the moment he found himself in. A stranger in a nurse's uniform was giving him something no friend, no fan, no doctor had managed to offer. Truth without condition. For a fleeting second, Elvis felt the walls inside him shift. He wasn't sure if it was trust or simply exhaustion. But in that small room, with its lingering smell of coffee and bleach, he realized how desperately he needed someone to look at him and see more than a crown. The nurse didn't reach for his hand. She didn't tell him it would be all right. She simply sat with him in the dim hum of the break room, and in that silence, he felt more human than he had in years. The warmth of the coffee lingered only briefly. As the silence stretched, Elvis shifted, leaning forward, his elbows pressing into the scarred table. The nurse's presence had pried open doors inside him he usually kept bolted shut. His voice, when it came, carried a tremor that wasn't weakness, but something deeper, like a string stretched too tightly, ready to snap. "There was a night," he began, eyes unfocused, gazing somewhere far beyond the room. "A few weeks ago. St. Louis. Place was packed, lights hotter than the devil's breath. I walked out there, and for a second, it felt like every other show. Band kicking in, crowd losing their minds. Then all at once—" He paused, swallowing hard. "The world went black. I couldn't see. My knees buckled, and I thought, this is it. I'm going to drop right here, in front of them all." His fingers tapped restlessly against the paper cup, knuckles pale. Do you know what went through my mind? Not the music, not the career, not the damn headlines. I thought about my little girl. I thought about her face when I left home. The way she hugged me like she already knew goodbyes came too easy in this life. And I thought, Lord, don't let her see me die in a spotlight. The nurse listened without interruption, her own breath measured, her eyes refusing to drift away. He searched her expression for judgment, for pity, but there was none. Only a quiet gravity, as if she understood the cost of carrying fear in silence. He exhaled sharply, almost a bitter laugh. Funny thing is, the crowd never knew. I straightened myself up, sang louder than before, finished the damn show. They cheered like it was the best they'd ever seen. And inside, I was praying I wouldn't collapse before the curtain fell. The confession tore something open in the air between them. His voice, usually velvet even in sorrow, cracked into a raw rasp, jagged as gravel. He rubbed his throat, almost embarrassed, though the words had already left him. The nurse leaned forward slightly. "One of my colleagues was there," she said gently. "She told me she watched you stumble. She prayed for you under her breath, the way you pray when you know the man in front of you doesn't realize he's breaking." Her words startled him. He blinked, absorbing them, a strange shiver running down his spine. Fate seemed to follow him even here, weaving threads he hadn't noticed. The idea of a stranger praying for him in the dark of a concert hall struck him harder than he expected. For the first time that night, he smiled. Not the dazzling curve that belonged to the stage, but a fragile, almost boyish smile that flickered and faded like a candle in a draught. "Maybe that's what kept me standing," he whispered. "A prayer I never heard." The moment was fragile, almost tender. And then it shattered. The door creaked open without warning. A man in a white coat stepped in, his expression severe. The hospital physician. Behind him, the faint shadow of security lingered in the hallway. The doctor's voice was clipped, firm, more reprimand than concern. "Mr. Presley, you shouldn't be discussing these matters. Stress is not what you need right now." Elvis's jaw clenched. The tone was wrong, too controlling, too rehearsed. It wasn't medicine speaking, it was management. The same polished authority he had endured for years, cloaked in concern, but dripping with command. He set the paper cup down with a quiet thud, eyes narrowing. The doctor's gaze flicked toward the nurse, disapproval sharp. "These conversations are not appropriate. You're here to rest, not to dwell on unnecessary things." Unnecessary. The word cut deep. His body, his fear, his soul, dismissed as though they were trivial inconveniences. For a heartbeat, Elvis said nothing. But inside, a storm was rising. He had spent years suffocated by handlers, advisors, bodyguards, all of them policing what he ate, what he said, what he revealed. And now, even in a hospital, even in a moment of vulnerability, the same invisible cage closed around him. He rose slowly from the chair, the legs scraping across the floor with a harsh groan. His height, his presence, seemed to swell the room, though his shoulders still bore exhaustion. He fixed the doctor with a steady stare, voice low and hoarse. "Unnecessary. I thought honesty was part of healing." The doctor's face tightened, but he didn't answer. Behind him, the shadow of a bodyguard shifted closer, as if preparing to escort Elvis back into compliance. The nurse held her ground, though her pulse quickened. She could feel the air thicken, charged with unspoken defiance. For Elvis, the realization struck like lightning. He was never free, not even here. The corridors, the doctors, the guards, They were only another extension of the stage. His life, monitored and managed, his truth filtered through the expectations of others. He turned back toward the nurse, and for a fleeting instant, his eyes softened. He wasn't angry with her. Quite the opposite. Her presence had given him what no one else dared. A mirror unclouded by fear or adoration. His throat burned as he spoke, each word carrying the ache of a broken voice. Seems even my weakness has to be approved by someone. The nurse said nothing. She didn't need to. The silence between them was enough, and for Elvis Presley, that silence spoke louder than the applause of 1,000 stadiums. The air in the break room felt heavier after the doctor's intrusion, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the tension. Elvis remained standing for a moment, his shoulders squared yet trembling faintly, before he lowered himself back into the chair. The guard's shadow withdrew, the door clicked shut, and silence reclaimed the small space. The nurse did not rush to speak. She let the moment settle, the way one lets dust fall after a storm. Then, slowly, she reached into the pocket of her uniform. Her fingers fumbled, hesitant, until she pulled out something folded and worn. A piece of paper, edges yellowed, creased a dozen times as though carried too long in too many places. She held it carefully, as though it might disintegrate in her hands. "I wasn't planning to show you this," she admitted, her voice low, "but maybe it's time." Elvis frowned slightly, curiosity piercing through the exhaustion in his eyes. The nurse unfolded the sheet, the crackle of aged paper loud in the quiet room. Written in uneven ink, the handwriting rushed and jagged, filled with the urgency of a man desperate to be heard. "It's from my brother," she explained, "the one I told you about. He wrote it in 1972, during his last year overseas. He wanted you to have it, but it never reached you." His brow furrowed. "Why not?" She let out a bitter breath. "Because your people intercepted it. Fans send thousands of letters, and the ones they don't like, the ones they think might bother you, they never let them through. This one got sent back to him. He gave it to me before he died. Said, if you ever get the chance, make sure he knows." The room seemed to shrink as she began to read. Her voice carried the words with care, steady, yet trembling at the edges. "Mr. Presley, I don't know if you'll ever see this, but I need you to hear me. In the jungle, when the night closed in and the world smelled of death, I put on my headphones. I heard your voice, and for a few minutes, I wasn't in Vietnam anymore. I was home, sitting on the porch, hearing my sister laugh, feeling like life was still waiting for me. You kept me alive when nothing else could. Don't ever forget what your songs mean to a man who's losing himself. You gave me hope. For that, I owe you more than I can ever repay." Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to finish. She lowered the paper slowly, the words still echoing in the air. Elvis sat frozen. His hands covered his mouth, his elbows braced against the table as though he were trying to hold his own face together. The paper trembled faintly in her hands, but his entire frame trembled more. He exhaled a shuddering breath, his voice muffled behind his palms. "I never saw it." "No," she said quietly. "You never saw hundreds like it. Maybe thousands. All filtered, screened, measured by people who thought they knew what you could handle." His hands slid down, revealing eyes that glistened under the harsh light. There was no performance in them, no polish, only grief and something sharper, longing. "Every day," he whispered, "they bring me bags full of mail. Piles I can't even look at. And I thought—" He stopped, searching for words. "I thought it was all just noise. people asking for something. But this was real. This was life. And they kept it from me. He leaned forward, his hands reaching toward the letter, but he hesitated before touching it, as if unworthy of the fragile truth it carried. At last, he placed his fingers lightly on the paper, the texture of age and ink grounding him in a way applause never had. The nurse's voice softened, no longer blunt, but heavy with a sister's ache. He wanted you to know you made a difference. He wanted you to remember you weren't singing into emptiness. Elvis's throat tightened. For years, he had been surrounded by fans screaming his name, by crowds worshiping the image they thought he was. Yet in that moment, he realized how starved he had been for real connection. The cheers had deafened him, but this letter pierced through, straight into the hollow part of his chest where loneliness lived. He closed his eyes, his hands covering his face again. When he spoke, the words were almost lost in his palms. I've been cut off. From them. From people who needed me. They built walls around me, told me it was to protect me. But it wasn't. It was to keep me blind. His voice cracked, and for the first time in the conversation, he let the tears come. They were not stage tears, not the carefully controlled emotion he sometimes displayed in interviews. These were jagged, raw, the tears of a man mourning the years stolen from him, the voices silenced before they could reach him. When he finally lowered his hands, his face was lined with sorrow but also with something else, a quiet fire, faint but undeniable. He looked at the nurse with eyes that had shifted, no longer glazed with fatigue but sharpened with recognition. "May I keep it?" he asked, his voice rough. "Please." She placed the letter in his hands without hesitation. He folded it carefully, reverently, as though it were scripture. Sliding it into his jacket pocket, he pressed his hand over it, his fingers splayed against the fabric as if to anchor it close to his heart. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The vending machine hummed. The fluorescent bulb buzzed faintly overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a phone rang and went unanswered, and in that ordinary noise, Elvis Presley sat with the extraordinary realization that the people who loved him most, the ones who prayed for him, who clung to his songs like lifelines, had been kept from his reach. It was a revelation that would not leave him. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, measured, heavy, purposeful. Elvis tensed instantly. The sound was too familiar, the slow sweep of shoes that belonged not to wandering nurses, but to men tasked with guarding him. His eyes darted to the door, then back to the nurse. The fragile cocoon of truth they had built in the break room was cracking. "They're looking for you," she whispered, almost apologetically. "I know," he said, his voice hushed, urgent. His hand pressed against his jacket pocket, where the letter now rested, as if afraid someone might rip it away before he had the chance to keep it. "Just give me another minute." The footsteps passed, but the tension remained. He leaned toward her, his voice quieter now, stripped of any trace of stage grandeur. "Tell me something. You've seen me out there, on the records, the TV, the stage. Do you think I'm happy when I'm up there?" The question startled her. It wasn't rhetorical. He wasn't fishing for reassurance. He genuinely wanted to know. She took a breath before answering. "I think, when you're singing, there's life in you. Real life. But when the music stops," her eyes softened with truth, "you disappear." The words landed like a blade drawn across old scar tissue. He lowered his gaze, his fingers tightening around the paper cup on the table until it crumpled. "That's the only time I feel alive anymore. on stage. Everything else is silence, like I'm a ghost in my own skin. He exhaled, his breath shuddering. I used to think the crown was an honor, to be called a king, to have the world bow at your feet. But it's a chain, heavy. Every step I take, it drags behind me. His eyes lifted back to hers, raw and piercing. I didn't choose this. I never wanted to be a monument. I just wanted to sing. The nurse held his gaze, her voice steady but laced with sadness. You built a legend, Mr. Presley. But there's still a man underneath. If you forget him, if you let him die, what's left will only be the shell. Her words struck deeper than any doctor's warnings, sharper than any newspaper headline. They cut through the illusion he had been carrying for years, that the legend could sustain him even as the man collapsed inside. He felt suddenly exposed, as if the walls themselves had been peeled back to reveal his rawest self. He thought of the nights when he sat alone in Graceland, surrounded by trophies and gold records, yet feeling more isolated than he had in the two-room house of his childhood. The cheers of millions could not drown out the silence of being unseen. The corridor outside flickered with light as a shadow moved past the frosted window in the door. His guards were still circling, hunting for him like he was property gone astray. He gritted his teeth. Even here, I can't breathe without someone watching. I thought hospitals were for healing, but it's just another stage. The nurse leaned closer, her tone firm. Then stop letting them write your script. You can still choose what part you play. The words jolted him. No one had spoken to him like that in years, not as a commodity, not as a patient, but as a man with agency, however buried. He rubbed his temples, his voice breaking. You don't understand. If I let go of the crown, there's nothing left. The world doesn't want me. They want him, the king, the rhinestones, the voice, the show. Without that, He stopped, the sentence unfinished, the fear unspoken. Her reply came swift, unwavering. You're still Elvis. A son, a father, a man who once stood in a hallway promising his mama he'd be strong. That man is still in you, whether you believe it or not. The silence that followed was suffocating. He closed his eyes, fighting against the tide of emotion swelling in his chest. Her words were dangerous because they were true. The nurse had unearthed the fracture inside him, the widening gulf between Elvis the man and Elvis the monument. A fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead, its glow casting harsh shadows across his face. For a moment, he imagined the corridor outside transformed into a concert hall, the ceiling lights into spotlights. The guard's footsteps became the pounding rhythm of a drum. And he was back on stage. Only this time, the audience was gone. Only one witness remained. The nurse. The thought shook him. He was no longer performing for thousands, no longer shielded by distance. Here, under her gaze, he was stripped of costume, applause, and myth. It was terrifying and liberating. From the hallway, a voice called softly, "Mr. Presley!" The guards were closing in. He turned quickly back to her, his eyes pleading. "Don't let them take this away from me." "Not yet." She said nothing, but her steady gaze answered for her. She would not betray what had been spoken here. And in that moment, as the footsteps grew louder, Elvis Presley realized something he hadn't admitted even to himself. The legend he carried was not the crown of a king. It was the weight of chains. The guards' voices drifted closer, their footsteps a steady drumbeat against the sterile floor. Elvis straightened, the faint panic of being found crawling through him. He glanced at the nurse, his voice dropping to a whisper. "One more moment. Please." She nodded, then leaned forward, lowering her voice to match his urgency. "Do you know what happened when the patients here heard you were in this hospital?" His eyes flicked toward her, curious despite himself. "They prayed for you," she said simply. "Men with failing hearts, women who barely had breath left, people who should have been thinking only of themselves. Yet, when they heard your name, they clasped their hands and whispered your songs like prayers. You're not just a singer to them. You're proof that hope still lives." Her words cut through him like a current, pulling him into silence. He had spent years believing the wall between him and the world was too thick, that their love was filtered into empty noise by the machinery of fame. And now, in this plain hospital, he learned strangers had bent their knees for him in the quiet of their suffering. The thought humbled him more than the roar of any stadium. The nurse reached into her pocket again. This time she pulled out something small, a wooden cross, smoothed by years of handling, its edges worn by countless fingers. She placed it on the table, sliding it gently toward him. "A man down the hall gave me this tonight," she explained. "Said if I saw you, I should pass it on. He called you the singer with the heart. Said you'd understand." Elvis stared at the object. It was nothing flashy, nothing gilded, just a sliver of wood, darkened by time and touch. He picked it up carefully, the grain rough against his fingertips. For a moment, he was silent, his throat tight, his eyes fixed on the cross. He had been handed diamond rings on stage, golden chains, expensive watches pressed into his palm by fans desperate to give back a piece of the love he gave them. But none of it had ever struck him like this. A piece of wood from a stranger, offered not for glory, not for attention, but as an act of pure faith. His lips trembled as he whispered, "They give me gold, and it shines for a moment. But this will outlast all of it." He closed his hand around the cross, pressing it into his palm until the edges dug into his skin. It hurt, just enough to remind him it was real. His breath came unsteady, but there was a new fire in his eyes, faint but unmistakable. "I can't keep living like this," he said, his voice low but fierce. "I've let them pull me in every direction. Managers, doctors, the world itself, and somewhere along the way, I stopped being in charge of my own soul." He lifted his gaze to the nurse, his tone almost pleading. "But if strangers are praying for me, if they still see something worth saving, then I have to try. I have to fight for it." The nurse held his gaze, her eyes glistening but steady. Then, "Fight. But not just for them. Do it for yourself." He nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking deep. The hospital room seemed to blur for a moment, his focus narrowing to the cross in his hand, the letter in his pocket, and the nurse's steady presence across from him. It was as if fate itself had cornered him here, stripped him bare, and handed him a choice: keep sinking beneath the crown, or claw his way back to the man he once promised he'd be. "I want to live," he said firmly, almost defiantly. "Not just survive shows. Not just crawl from stage to stage. I want to live long enough to see my daughter grow, to make music because it matters, not because it's expected. I want to walk into a room and not feel chained by it." The words poured out like a vow, raw and unpolished, but truer than anything he had spoken in years. The nurse exhaled softly, relief mingled with sorrow. "Then promise me you'll try. Promise me you won't forget tonight once the lights are back on and the voices start telling you who to be again." Elvis clenched the cross tighter, pressing it to his chest as though sealing it into his very heart. His voice cracked, but the conviction in it was unmistakable. "I promise. I swear it. I'll try to change. I'll try to take back my life." Outside, the guard's footsteps grew louder, echoing like a countdown. The fragile sanctuary of the staff room was seconds away from breaking. Yet in that moment, surrounded by the faint hum of the vending machine and the sharp scent of disinfectant, Elvis Presley found a piece of strength he thought he had lost forever. It wasn't born of applause, or riches, or crowns. It was born of a wooden cross pressed into his hand by a stranger who believed in him, and a nurse who dared to speak truth when no one else would. He sat taller, shoulders squaring with a dignity that hadn't come from fame, but from something purer. The crown still weighed on him, but for the first time, he no longer bowed beneath it. And deep inside, he knew, if he was to be saved at all, the fight had to begin now. The moment ended, not with a choice, but with inevitability. The door opened, light spilling from the corridor, and two guards stepped in with the precision of men trained never to show hesitation. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to shift the air in the room, to remind Elvis that his minutes of freedom were over. "Mr. Presley," one said softly, with the careful tone reserved for royalty or fragile glass, "it's time." Elvis stood slowly, his hand still clutching the wooden cross, the letter pressed safely against his chest beneath the folds of his jacket. For a moment, he seemed taller than before, not in stature but in presence, as though the quiet fire he had found here gave him a strength the sequined suits never could. The nurse rose as well, her hands folded before her. She didn't move closer. She knew this was the point where their paths would diverge again. One pulled back into the machinery of fame, the other left behind in the fluorescent corridors of the hospital. He walked toward the door, the guards flanking him like shadows. Then, just as he reached the threshold, he paused. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his head and looked back at her. His voice, when it came, was low, quiet enough that only she could hear. "You're the only one tonight who told me the truth." The words lingered in the sterile air, simple yet heavier than any speech he had ever given on stage. Then he turned again, and the guards guided him down the hallway, their measured steps echoing into the distance until the sound dissolved into silence. The nurse remained where she stood, the hum of the vending machine the only sound now. She pressed her hands together, not in prayer, but in stillness, absorbing the weight of what had just passed between them. She knew instinctively that this night would never leave her, not because she had spoken to a legend, but because she had spoken to a man who had been suffocating beneath that legend. And for a brief, fragile window of time, he had let her see him. Days later, her shift ended with a call to the front desk. A delivery had arrived with no sender's name, no return address. She frowned, signing the clipboard, and carried the small bundle back to the break room. Inside was a bouquet of white roses, fresh, their petals cool to the touch, releasing a faint fragrance that filled the sterile air with something soft, something human. Nestled among the stems was a small card. No emblem, no flourish. Just a few words, written in simple ink. "Thank you. E." She sat down slowly, the roses resting across her lap. The fragrance carried her back instantly to that night, to the hushed corridor, to the sight of a man who had carried the world on his shoulders and nearly collapsed beneath it. She pressed the card between her palms, her vision blurring as tears welled, and finally slipped free. They weren't tears of regret. They weren't even tears of sorrow. They were the kind of tears that came when one realized they had witnessed something unrepeatable, a moment where truth had broken through the noise of the world. She knew she would never see him again. Not like that, not stripped bare of the myth. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that he had heard her, and more importantly, he had carried that truth with him when he left. In the weeks that followed, she found herself walking the corridors at night, the scent of roses lingering in her memory, reminding her that even legends were human, and sometimes all a human needed was someone willing to speak without fear. The hospital walls remained sterile, the hum of lights and machines unchanging. Yet for her, every echo of footsteps in the hallway carried a different weight now. Because she had stood in the quiet and spoken to a man who had the world's attention, and yet was desperate for one honest voice. And in that silence after his words, she had discovered that truth itself was louder than any ovation.